Martin North, John Adams. In the interest of the people. Hello, John.
Hello, sir.
It's getting serious.
It's a very serious day. Actually, a very sad and somber day, I think. What we have seen, Martin, is perhaps one of the greatest unleashings of central bank madness right around the world. We saw a coordinated effort by central banks to unleash huge amounts of liquidity, massive cuts in interest rates, and we'll go through all of the individual countries that have gone through, that have implemented steps today. We are now in, I would say, full crisis mode in terms of the financial system. And again, one of the questions that has to be asked, Martin, how does a health crisis lead to a financial crisis? It's because of the debt bubble. And this is one of the key points that the system, the establishment, won't admit to, that there was a debt problem to begin with. It was unsustainable. It was always going to lead into catastrophe in some form or another. Obviously, we've said that the coronavirus is not the cause of the crisis. This has happened, well before, starting in September. But this coronavirus has really sped up the crisis, and now governments and central banks are in full panic mode. They have unleashed sort of untold actions today, and the big outcome is it hasn't worked. And why? Because confidence has basically collapsed. And we saw with the ASX 200 today down 10%. We see when you look at the Dow futures, they're on track to probably lose about 1,200 points. So all of this action was I think designed to do two things. One is to provide banks with enough funds and the financial system, because without that we would have seen a massive default over the weekend. And the other point of this action is to provide confidence that the financial system is intact, and yet confidence was not restored in this action. And I dare say that in the next 48 to 72 hours, we're going to see even more announcements by governments and central banks, because so far what they have put out there hasn't worked.
And just to be clear, I don't think there was ever an intention to try and save the stock market, right? So you got to look at the bond markets, right?
Yes.
And in fact, after the Fed's announcements, the bond markets did come back a bit, right? So in other words, those high prices that were being paid for in terms of rates on bonds did come back. That's what they were trying to do, because those costs of the bonds were actually going through the roof, and that would have actually destroyed the financial system very quickly, right? So it has come back, but the costs of doing it is the issue, right? Because what they're doing is basically creating money out of thin air, lifting the debt even higher, and creating a bigger issue later.
What I want to do first, Martin, is just talk about what happened over the weekend. So in our last show that we put out on Saturday, so today is Monday, we recorded it on Friday night, and we based our numbers about the repo market based on Friday morning's numbers Australian time. Now, Saturday morning Australian time, we had some new numbers, and let's actually put slide 1 on the screen. So basically, in our last show, we said that the repo bailout was at 782 billion. Where we ended up on Saturday morning was 808 billion. So if we go to slide 2, so basically we've gone from September, which was basically zero, all the way up to more than 800 billion. So and no doubt, as we head out throughout this week, this 800 billion figure could even become larger. We could even hit $1 trillion by the end of the week. And what that shows is that the pace of the increases of liquidity injections is actually ramping up quite quickly.
And it's just worth saying, Powell actually had a audio conference call, which was on Sunday evening in the US, which I listened to, right? And he made a really interesting point, because he basically admitted that the repo strategy that they tried to execute didn't work, right? Which was the 1.5 trillion, because there was hardly subscribed.
That's right.
Right. And then they went and purchased various sorts of assets. Yes. And he said that didn't work, which is why we're now cutting the rate. So he's actually, on that call, he actually admitted that the repo stuff wasn't doing what it should be doing.
The financial system broke in September. They've thrown $800 billion, and they've used a number of different mechanisms, whether through overnight repos, term repos, or these permanent purchases. And now they're saying none of that worked, and now they have to go to effectively pushing the ultimate nuclear option.
We are really in uncharted waters now. And I have to say, whilst a lot of people are saying that the central banks are not out of ammo, they can go on doing this for a lot longer, the impact is not what they want.
So why was this done? Now, you basically pointed on the key point, which was that particularly on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, particularly when we were looking at the US Treasury market, there was a sell-off in long-term dated bonds, 10-year bonds, 30-year bonds. So the interest rates on long-term debt was actually rising. That was a concern to the central banks, because if that trend continues, that basically meant that that debt in that of that maturity would be too expensive, and that could lead to significant defaults among hedge funds, among in terms of small banks, large banks, etc., and that could have imploded the financial system. So I have to say, Martin, I did have a conversation with one of our viewers on Saturday, and what I don't think is coming clear through our shows is how on edge this whole system is. I mean, we are talking basically a full societal collapse, a full economic collapse. I mean, this viewer had 6 figures in the bank, and I said, without this money, that without this 800 billion, our banks would be dead. Your money would be gone. I mean that's how literal we are talking, and yet I think for some people, it's unimaginable because they've never lived it in their lifetime. So I think that's just an important point that we have to sort of say, that with all this debt, if the interest rates go up too high, you will get a declaration of insolvency from a large institution, and that will melt down the system. So in order to avoid that, they've announced this sort of coordinated global effort to basically try to save the system, which they did today, So in the interim. And yet we only have about 12 hours of information before us. The yields on the bonds have come down. Confidence has been shattered because this was in a desperate and extreme action. Stock markets have collapsed, and obviously we have to track this on a day-by-day basis as to, can they keep the interest rates down, or will all this action still fail, and we'll still see a complete meltdown of the financial system, within a week or 2 weeks or even a month?
There are people shorting this market, so there are people betting that the rates are going to go the other way, right? And that's part of the pressure that they're on. It's interesting that ASIC here in Australia has actually stopped some of the larger organisations from short selling to try and put more stability back into the system. So bit by bit, the market dynamics are being more and more crimped and trying to be controlled. But there's no guarantee it's going to work.
It comes back to the key frustration I've had. I've been trying to warn parliamentarians for many years. I went on national TV last year. I actually applied for a job at the RBA. I applied at a job at the Treasury. No interviews. They said it was a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist. And here we are.
Yep. And it's playing out, unfortunately, precisely the way that we thought that it would.
Absolutely.
Which is doesn't make me proud. It just makes me cross, because we could see it, and yet those in authority chose not to see it.
Now, in terms of the key action that was done today, so let's start with the US Federal Reserve, because Jerome Powell, the chairman, actually made a couple of key announcements. So the first so there's 3 key announcements out of America. So the first one was about a global coordinated deal about ensuring that there was enough liquidity going around in terms of the system among certain central banks. So I'm just going to put this, we'll put the quote on the screen and let me read it to you. So quote, "The Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, and the Swiss National Bank are today announcing a coordinated action to enhance the provision of liquidity via the standing US dollar liquidity swap line arrangements. These central banks have agreed to lower the pricing on the standard US dollar liquidity swap arrangements by 25 basis points, so that the new rate will be the US dollar overnight index swap rate plus 25 basis points." So basically they're saying that, so there's a number of arrangements, what they call their swap lines, where you get to swap, securities for funds. And they're saying that those lines of liquidity between central banks, they're lowering the cost of that. So that obviously if you lower the cost, that means there's more incentive to push money around the system. So if anyone's short of money, they can get that money at a cheaper cost, so that they, so that no one in the central banks or the banking system is short of funds that would lead to a liquidity crisis.
Yeah, and it worked initially, because the bond rate in the US dropped by somewhere between 30 and 50%. So that was a big move. And it was directly after Powell's announcement.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was action 1 out of the US.
Yep.
Now, action 2 was they cut official policy rates. So we work on a particular interest rate target, whereas they work on a band. So they went from 1 to 1.25 down to 0 to 0.25. So that's the lowering of the interest rate. And then they announced a quantitative easing program of $700 billion. Now, so the important point on this point, Martin, is that so when we're talking about the repos, so repos is basically looking at short-term interim loans, but then these permanent purchases of these T-bills. Now, everyone was calling that quantitative easing except the Federal Reserve, because they said that the purpose of quantitative easing is to push down the long end of the yield curve. So this is when you're buying 10-year and 30-year bonds to actually push down the interest rates, and they were buying basically bonds of 1 year maturity or less. So we've had an $800 billion bailout of the short end of the curve, and now they're saying we're putting another $700 billion to bail out the long end of the curve. So altogether, so far, $1.5 trillion confirmed. And obviously, as we go forward, we'll see what happens in the repo market, whether they throw more money at that, and whether there's $700 billion to suppress rates at the long end, whether that's the end of it or whether we're going to see even more going forward.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised to see more mortgage-backed security purchases and a whole bunch of other purchases. You know, the Japanese are probably ahead of the curve, if I can call it like that, right? In terms of they buy pretty much anything that moves, right, to try and actually continue to build their balance sheets.
Absolutely. Now, so that was announcement 2. Now, announcement 3, which is actually, when you think about it, it's quite stunning.
Yep.
Is that basically the Americans have said to their banks, whatever reserves you have on your books, we want you to let go of those reserves and actually push it out into the economy. So, you know, part of the issue with the GFC was certain banks in America didn't have enough reserves. Then they had the Dodd-Frank reforms that would basically build up a bit of a buffer. And that buffer is in some cases quite large in terms of billions of dollars for certain banks. And now they have said that we're going to push all of this money out into the economy, flood the system with credit just to keep the bubble going. So we actually have an official statement on this particular point. So let's put this on the screen. Quote, so this is from the OFMC. Quote, in light of the shift to an ample reserves regime, the board has reduced reserve requirement ratios to 0% effective on March 26, the beginning of the next reserve maintenance period. This action eliminates reserve requirements for thousands of depository institutions and will help to support lending to households and businesses. So basically, they're saying to the banks, no reserves, just get the money out there as quickly as you can.
And John, just think about that. What they're doing is trying to push more and more and more credit out into the economy, right, on the assumption that businesses and households are going to take it. The question is, given that the virus is really just cramping everybody's style and there's not a lot of business activity, who's going to take it?
Yeah. So, Martin, I think that's a great question. Is, you know, if businesses grind to a halt, no one has the capacity to borrow because business is not happening and you don't need the funds. But even if you did need the funds, now maybe there could be some refinancing for those who want better terms. But other than that, because particularly on new lending, if confidence is shattered among households and businesses because of the virus and because of the stock market collapsing, etc., American households and businesses are less likely to borrow when confidence is down. And so again, you make a very valid point.
And so it's that disconnection between the central bank activity, trying to get the retail banks to push money out into the economy, credit out into the economy. The disconnection between that and what people are likely to do, I don't think they've got their head around.
Yes. Well, yeah. So I think a lot of these announcements are just like they seem quite desperate, last minute sort of tactics, and perhaps it's because of what you just said was they tried throwing $800 billion at the repo market and that just failed. So they said, well, what else can we do? Like we've got to sort of we're just drawing straws now.
Yeah, and the Fed says we've got lots of tools. Well, they've tried this one, that didn't work very well. Got this one, well, it hasn't worked. Okay, we'll go and try that one then. I mean, that feels to me what's been going on.
Yeah, and the thing about that, Martin, is what did we say in our last show? That the Titanic hit the iceberg on the 17th of September.
Yep.
So, they can try any which way to keep the ship afloat, but we know which way the ship is going. It's going deep into the sea, deep into the ocean.
I can hear the water rising.
Indeed. Now, so beyond the US, we had a number of big announcements. So this morning at 6 a.m. Australian time, which was 8 a.m. New Zealand time, New Zealand announced a interest rate cut from 1% down to 0.25%, so 75 basis points. And in their announcement, they said that they would be holding this rate for 12 months. Now, will there be more from New Zealand? We'll have to see on that.
And just worth saying, they also stopped the capital lift that they were going to be doing. So the banks in New Zealand were being told to raise their capital ratios. That's been taken away. Mm-hmm. So again, trying to encourage banks to lend more.
Yes.
And they actually said that will give significant additional capacity for banks to lend more. And I go back to my same question. Yes, but who's going to take the money?
How is piling debt upon debt a solution to a massive debt bubble?
And it doesn't cure viruses.
It doesn't cure virus. Well, yeah. But the thing is that so what people need to understand on that, Martin, is that this is not about curing a virus. It's about defending the biggest debt bubble in the history of the world.
I know.
So there's two issues at hand: a public health crisis and a debt crisis. And basically they're trying to defend the in terms of the debt bubble. So that's what we saw from New Zealand. Now, in terms of Canada, Canada cut interest rates by 0.5%, so they're now at 0.75. Now, this is the second interest rate cut in a fortnight. So a fortnight ago, they cut 0.5% from 1.75% to 1.25%. That was about a fortnight ago, and then today they've cut another 0.5%. So now they're at 0.75, and obviously, as we speak tonight, Australia is at 0.5. So that's what happened with in terms of Canada. Now, in terms of Australia, so the Council for Financial Regulators came out with a statement this morning, and they basically said that Australia, so we've been talking a lot about the Americans and their repo operations. Now, we saw on Friday the RBA, according to the AFR, put out 8.8 billion into the banks. Now, what I can confirm to the audience is I've actually emailed the RBA a series of questions about that specific 8.8 billion, and so I'll be interested to see if the RBA comes back with a response and what the response is on the 8.8 billion. But beyond the 8.8 billion, they've said that they've announced a whole series of new repo operations that they're now pushing forward. And what I'm going to do is just actually read the key statement by the Council of Financial Regulators. So this is the quote, "The RBA is continuing to support the liquidity of the system. As part of this support, it will be conducting 1 month and 3 month repurchase operations until further notice. In addition, it will conduct repo operations of 6 months maturity or longer, at least weekly, as long as market conditions warrant. The Australian Prudential Regulation Authority is ensuring banking institutions pre-position themselves to take advantage of the RBA's supportive measures." So again, that's what the RBA has announced today. And so beyond that, so we'll get back to the RBA in a second. So beyond that, the Bank of Japan has so like you said, they've been buying everything in sight. They've been buying shares and ETFs and bonds for a long time, and they actually ramped up their purchases of ETFs today in trading. And then obviously beyond what the Japanese have done, thinking about what happened in the last week. So last week, the Bank of England cut interest rates by 0.5% down to 0.25. So when you look at all of this that has happened today in the last 24 hours, now maybe you can correct me, Martin, but from my reading of monetary history, this is the largest unleashing of central bank power in the history of the world.
Yeah, I agree. I've never seen... I've been through 4 crises, right? So I can remember the old ones too. This, in terms of the absolute quantum, it's trillions that people are putting in around the world in terms of liquidity on the biggest debt bubble already.
Absolutely.
It's nonsensical.
Yes.
The trouble is that it doesn't solve anything.
No. The thing is, it doesn't solve anything. All it's doing is buying time.
Yep.
And again, what did we say in the last show? It comes at a cost.
Yep.
And what I think Australians watching the nightly news is not going to be told is that this is the biggest, global effort in the history of the world, and that it's not going to work, and that it comes at a cost. And I don't think the news is actually going to say to Australians, this is exactly what the cost of this monetary madness is.
And it's just worth pausing and thinking, where does the money come from in the first place, right? And we've said before, and it's worth us reiterating, essentially we've got governments issuing securities which are then being bought by the central banks. So effectively, the numbers on both sides are going up. So it's basically just making the numbers bigger, right? It's not actually doing anything more than that.
No, that's what's happened today.
Yep.
Now, no doubt central banks and governments around the world will be announcing further measures in the days ahead and in the weeks ahead. Now, in terms of the RBA, so the RBA have announced that they will be putting out a new statement out on Thursday, they'll be putting out more measures. So today they said they're doing repo. What I think they'll be launching on Thursday is quantitative easing. So what? Here's the key thing. What did the RBA governor say in November in his speech? He said we'll get to 0.25 and then we're going to pause. And then we're going to contemplate. And then if it's absolutely necessary, then we're going to do QE. Well, less than 6 months after that speech, they're going to start QE on Thursday. And let's actually put a speech so the RBA governor himself put out a statement on the RBA website. So let's actually go to the governor's statement. So this is the quote, the Reserve Bank stands ready to purchase Australian government bonds in the secondary market to support the smooth functioning of that market, which is a key pricing benchmark for the Australian financial system. The bank will announce further policy measures to support the Australian economy on Thursday. So what I think we'll see on Thursday, Martin, is the cash rate will go from a half to a quarter, and QE will start. And so I'm on the mailing list of Westpac when Westpac put out their public announcements. And this afternoon, Westpac put out an email to their subscribers saying that's precisely what they think will happen on Thursday. And all the indications is we're going to do QE. We're going to be at 0.25%. And again, this is only round one of the crisis that we're now in, knowing that it's going to get likely to be worse in the next months ahead. So we've always said negative interest rates. Now, I don't think we'll see negative interest rates this week, but once they do QE, once they get to 0.25, they've got nowhere else to go but negative.
And your mate Christopher Joy wrote an article over the weekend saying, I've written to the Reserve Bank and said you should be actually not just doing government bond purchases, but essentially purchase mortgage-backed securities and other corporate bonds. Others buy everything, right? Completely objective, no independent, nothing to do with any of his holdings, right? There is a school of thought that says they'll have to go beyond treasuries.
Yes. Well, I mean, Christopher Joy, a $2 billion fund, he has a lot of those mortgage-backed securities and a whole bunch of other goodies in his portfolio. So if the RBA is willing to buy them at an inflated price, I'm sure Christopher Joy will make a profit for his investors and he'll be happy. So again, when people at the AFR speak, are they objective or are they conflicted? That's a question for the audience to decipher, I think. Now, on fiscal policy, so couple of points on fiscal policy. So last week we saw an announcement about a stimulus package of $17.6 billion, including a whole bunch of free money for 6.5 million people in terms of this $750 in terms of New Start people, pensioners, etc. So
and John, just worth saying, I think that was 3/4 tilted towards business and 1/4 towards households.
Yes.
So that was the relative distribution. A lot of it was actually trying to get businesses to invest.
Yeah. So that was round one.
Yep.
Now what we learned from the AFR today is that Morrison's now contemplating round two. So here's the thing. So it's less than a week, and now we're saying we need to do round two. So there is a round two stimulus package being put together. Now, interestingly, and actually quite shockingly, I actually tweeted about this over the weekend, is the CEO of COSBOA, which is the Council for Small Business. They put out a statement, and this was reported by the Daily Mail, that the stimulus package shouldn't be 17 billion, it should be 60 billion. And again, I mean, everyone is willing to bankrupt the country. And in my view, So and we've had this conversation multiple times. There's a short-term cost. There's a long-term cost. I mean, if Morrison is willing to basically accumulate tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars to save his government today, well, what is the consequence of that? Federal government debt will never be paid back. Once we hit $1 trillion and a half federal government debt, forget it. We're never going to pay it back. So we're either going to lead to a default, hyperinflation, or we're basically going to be debt servitude for the next 100 years. And it's not just my kids, but probably my great-grandkids will still be paying down this debt. And the fact that our Prime Minister would be willing to enslave his own people for a century with this sort of magnitude of reckless spending that's only happening within the space of a week. I mean, what sort of leadership are we seeing from the Prime Minister?
Well, they have basically boxed themselves into this remarkably narrow corner, right? They're reluctantly coming to the party and saying we've got to do something. I don't think they've necessarily thought through all the consequences of what they've suggested they're going to do. And the question again I come back to is, even throwing more money at households and businesses in the current environment where they're pretty much closed down, how's that going to help?
The only way that can help, Martin, is that obviously as business and households are shutting down, the ability to pay back the current loans, that becomes more into question. So the only thing that this debt can do is actually help alleviate some of the pressure in terms of the ability to pay back these loans now. Now, if we go back to a speech that we covered back in 2018 when the RBA governor spoke at the CEDA National Conference dinner, and there was the suggestion by the governor that with the expansion of fiscal policy in the next crisis, people need to understand what the RBA wants to do is they want to transfer private sector debt, which is effectively household debt and bank debt, to the balance sheet of the federal government. So basically they're going to say we're going to enslave the entire population for the next 50 years, 100 years, could be longer depending, in order to bail out the banks. So the bailing out the banks either through QE or through those repo operations, or if you start transferring debt effectively from the bank's balance sheet to the government's balance sheet. I mean, this is all about bankrupting the country in order to save the banks, and this is the ultimate statement about who runs the country and who has ultimate financial and political power.
Yeah, and my concern is, John, that we end up with a banking system that's survived, right, but nothing else has. And so what we've done is essentially distorted the entire economy of the country just to the benefit of the banking system.
Yes. Well, I mean, particularly if you, for example, look at the United States. I mean, that's what happened after the GFC.
Yep.
I mean, they basically gutted the country in order to save the banks. So it looks like that we are going to go through that process now, and we will come back to this conversation because I think it's so fundamental. I mean, again, you and I and Sean Quinn in an episode in 2018, we said let the banks go, take the depression. It's a severe 5-year hit, but in the long term, if we can eliminate the debt, if we can restructure the banks, if we can restructure the economy away from these speculative bubbles, our kids and our grandkids will be better off for it compared to the current path that our leadership is taking us today.
Yeah, because it's a one-way path to nowhere.
Exactly. So Martin, to conclude today's episode, the crisis is really coming to its climax, to its apex. We saw the greatest action by central banks in the history of the world. So far it has had limited effect. So yes, a little bit sort of a reduction of bond rates for now. Massive hit on confidence. Everyone's panicking. What I can tell you that in the bullion market that I work in, huge concern, huge panic from the Australian people. Not only just in the sort of area that I work in, but in other bullion companies across the country. I mean, there are literally, I heard it in Sydney, lines around the corner, people wanting to basically get their money out of the banks and to get gold and silver and basically looking for areas of safety or perceived areas of safety. So huge issues around that. And obviously this is on top of a run on toilet paper and fights in the shopping centres and people stocking up on essential goods like food and white goods and all of this sort of stuff. So we have that. One of the things I think is important to say, Martin, is that we've been trying to talk about this to our audience for more than 18 months. a good chunk of our audience have listened to what we've had to say and have taken action. Some people who are new to us and some people who have listened to us for a long time haven't taken action. And then there's millions of people who have no idea who we are. I would say that for millions of people who have not prepared for this moment, whether you've got, if you've got hugely in debt, or if you've had large amounts of your wealth invested in some of these in these asset bubbles like stocks, your ability to escape the system now is quite severely limited. And we'll talk about it perhaps in the next show about some of the issues that people have been hearing about getting money out of the banks. So I testified in Parliament in January about before the coronavirus, it was harder to get money out of the banks, and I was hearing more and more stories about people facing roadblocks by the banks. Well, in the last 12 hours, I've heard more stories of people finding it hard to withdraw significant sums out of the banks, particularly the big four. And so if people want to sort of see some of the stories that I've been commenting about, they can go to my social media accounts on Twitter or Facebook, and they can read some of the things I've been updating. But the whole point of this was people called particularly me, they called me a scaremonger. It's not about scaring people, it's about giving people forewarning so that you can take action, so that when this moment comes, you are prepared and you are ready. And so luckily for me and my family, we're ready. But for millions of others, they are at the mercy of the markets.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the window of opportunity closed.
So I think there's, particularly depending on circumstances, there's a small window in the next maybe few days to do a few things. But as this crisis deepens, the ability to escape from the system and actually get safety and actually, here's the thing, particularly if you've got a large mortgage, you're basically done. You don't have much ability to go. And so, obviously there'll be a big question as to if you've lost your job because of the virus or because of the shutdown, or if your hours or your income has been impaired, how do you service that mortgage going forward? There are big questions about how that actually will work in the next weeks and months.
Perhaps we'll come back to that because there are a whole bunch of issues relating to that. But John, I think we should just pause again and say this is unprecedented what we've seen today.
Yeah.
Right? And this is now right in the middle of the first stage of the financial crisis. But people need to understand this isn't the beginning of the end. It might be the end of the beginning, but this is going to run and run for quite some time. And the consequences will echo down the generations.
Absolutely.
John, I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. We'll see you next time.